I still remember the exact words Brenda Holloway laughed as she waved that violation notice in front of my mailbox. "Enjoy tearing it down, Grant," she said with a smile so confident it practically echoed across the street. What she didn't know was that less than 2 weeks later, she would be standing speechless inside my house, staring at a private lake where my basement used to be. My name is Grant Mercer, and until that summer, I thought I understood how homeowners associations worked. I had lived in Brookstone Ridge, a quiet neighborhood outside Nashville, for almost 8 years. The place was beautiful, the neighbors mostly kept to themselves, and the HOA rarely bothered anyone who followed the published rules. I wasn't looking for trouble. I worked as a structural engineer, spent my weekends restoring classic fishing boats, and preferred conversations with my Labrador over neighborhood gossip. After years of saving and planning, I finally decided to install an above-ground swimming pool behind my house. It wasn't flashy. It measured just over 24 feet across, included a professional filtration system, and was surrounded by a cedar deck I had built myself. My nieces visited every summer, and I wanted them to have a place where we could spend long afternoons together without driving to crowded public pools. Before ordering a single piece of equipment, I did what every careful homeowner should do. I read every page of the HOA covenants, every architectural guideline, and every amendment that had been adopted during the past decade. There wasn't a single sentence banning above-ground pools. The only requirement was that outdoor recreational structures receive architectural approval before installation. I submitted detailed drawings, photographs, engineering specifications, and a landscaping plan. 30 days passed without a response. According to the governing documents, no response within 30 days meant automatic approval. I waited another week just to be safe before construction began. The installation took 4 days. My neighbors complimented the finished project. Children riding bicycles slowed down to admire the cedar deck. Even Mr. Hansen from across the street joked that it looked nicer than the community pool. Everything seemed perfect until Saturday morning. I walked outside with a cup of coffee and found 3 people standing near my driveway. Brenda Holloway was impossible to miss. She favored expensive designer clothes covered in oversized jewelry that sparkled even in the shade, and she carried herself as though every sidewalk belonged exclusively to her. She was the president of the HOA, and she enjoyed reminding people of that fact every chance she got. Beside her stood 2 members of the architectural committee, both avoiding eye contact while Brenda held a bright red envelope. "Grant," she announced loudly enough for nearby neighbors to hear, "your pool violates our community standards." I looked at the envelope before looking back at her. "Interesting," I replied. "Which standard?" She smiled confidently. "The new one." I frowned. "New?" Brenda crossed her arms. "The board voted last night to prohibit all above-ground pools effective immediately." I asked the obvious question. "Last night? After my pool was already completed?" "Correct," she answered. "You have 72 hours to remove it." I opened the envelope and slowly read every page. The amendment was dated the previous evening. The ink practically looked fresh. There was no mention of existing installations, no grandfather clause, and no explanation for immediate enforcement. I looked up calmly. "When was this meeting announced?" Brenda's smile tightened. "The board handled it. According to the bylaws," I said, "members are supposed to receive advance notice before amendments are voted on." She shrugged as if procedure were merely a suggestion. "The board determined this was an urgent matter." One of the committee members shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Several neighbors had quietly gathered nearby, pretending to check their mail while listening to every word. Brenda noticed the audience and raised her voice. "If you fail to remove the pool within 72 hours, daily fines of $500 will begin immediately." I folded the notice carefully instead of arguing. Years of engineering had taught me that emotional reactions rarely solved complicated problems. Facts did. Rules did. Precise wording did. I simply nodded. "Thank you for delivering the paperwork." Brenda looked almost disappointed that I wasn't angry. "That's all you have to say?" she asked. I smiled politely. "For today." She turned on her heel, clearly expecting me to panic after she left. Instead, I spent the afternoon reading every governing document again, this time even more carefully than before. I highlighted definitions, cross-referenced amendments, and printed county property regulations. By sunset, my dining room table was covered with binders, legal pads, and engineering sketches. Around midnight, I reached one sentence buried deep inside the architectural standards. It was only 16 words long, but it changed everything. The HOA prohibited above-ground pools, inflatable pools, and similar recreational water structures located outdoors. Outdoors. I read the sentence 5 more times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. There was nothing about indoor water features. Nothing about finished basements. Nothing about private interior construction. I leaned back in my chair, looked toward the basement door, and laughed quietly to myself for the first time all day. Brenda believed she had taken away my swimming pool. She had no idea she had just inspired something much, much bigger. The next morning, I called in a favor from someone I trusted more than anyone when it came to complicated construction projects. His name was Daniel Brooks, a licensed geotechnical engineer I had worked with for nearly 15 years. We had designed retaining walls, flood control systems, and reinforced foundations together on commercial projects across Tennessee. If anyone could tell me whether my idea was brilliant or completely unrealistic, it was Daniel. He arrived just after breakfast carrying a laser level, a structural tablet, and the same expression he always wore before inspecting an unusual project. We walked downstairs into my unfinished basement, and I handed him a copy of the HOA amendment with the key sentence highlighted. He read it twice before looking up at me. "You are thinking exactly what I think you are thinking, are you not?" I nodded toward the open concrete floor. "What if the pool is not outside?" Daniel looked around the basement for nearly a minute without saying a word. He measured the ceiling height, examined the foundation walls, checked the floor thickness from the original construction plans that I had saved, and finally smiled. "Technically," he said, "you are asking the wrong question." I raised an eyebrow. "What is the right question?" He tapped the blueprint. "The question is not whether you can build a pool. The question is whether the structure can safely support a contained body of water." That answer started a 3-hour engineering discussion that completely changed my weekend. We calculated soil pressure beneath the slab, reviewed reinforcement schedules, estimated hydrostatic loads, and analyzed every support wall in the basement. Daniel remained cautious throughout the process, rejecting several of my early ideas before settling on a design that could actually work without compromising the house. The existing concrete slab alone was not enough. We would need to remove sections of it, excavate carefully, pour a reinforced containment shell, install multiple waterproof membranes, and add an advanced drainage monitoring system beneath the structure. It would not simply be a giant swimming pool. It would function more like a professionally engineered indoor water reservoir. "This is going to cost more than the original pool," Daniel said honestly. I laughed. It already became about more than the pool. He understood exactly what I meant. This was never about proving Brenda wrong through anger. It was about proving that careless rules often created consequences no one anticipated. Before Daniel left, he gave me one more piece of advice. Do everything by the book. Every permit, every inspection, every receipt. If someone wants to challenge you later, make sure the paperwork is stronger than their opinion. That sentence became my roadmap. On Monday morning, I visited the county building department carrying a complete engineering package. The building official spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing the drawings before asking several technical questions about waterproofing, emergency drainage capacity, ventilation, and structural reinforcement. Thanks to Daniel's calculations, every answer was already documented. The official finally nodded. "It is unusual," he admitted with a small smile. "But unusual does not mean prohibited." My permit application moved forward. I left the office with a growing stack of approved documents and an even bigger grin. The first construction trucks arrived 2 days later. Because everything entered through my garage, very little was visible from the street. Neighbors only noticed concrete cutting equipment, pallets of steel reinforcement, and several deliveries marked with plumbing and waterproofing suppliers. Naturally, curiosity spread faster than facts. By Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with messages from neighbors asking whether I was finishing my basement. I answered every one of them honestly. "I am working on a new home improvement project." That statement was completely true. Brenda, however, did not appreciate vague answers. Around noon, she appeared at the end of my driveway wearing oversized sunglasses, an expensive floral jacket despite the summer heat, and enough jewelry to reflect sunlight across 3 houses. She never stepped onto my property because she knew better after our previous conversation, but she watched every contractor entering through the garage. When I walked outside to collect my mail, she smiled politely in the way people do when they are trying very hard not to reveal how curious they really are. "Busy week," she said. "It has been productive," I replied. Her eyes shifted toward the construction trailer parked beside my garage. "Finishing the basement. Improving the property. Planning another surprise?" she asked. "I always enjoy improving my home." She waited several seconds for more information. None came. Finally, she folded her arms. "Just remember that any additional exterior improvements require board approval." I smiled. "Thank you for the reminder." She seemed frustrated that every sentence I spoke remained completely accurate without revealing anything useful. After she drove away, one of my contractors chuckled quietly. "She asks a lot of questions. She enjoys having answers even more," I replied. Construction accelerated over the next several days. The old above-ground pool disappeared exactly one day before Brenda's 72-hour deadline expired. She celebrated by sending another notice thanking me for my compliance. I almost laughed when I read it. From her perspective, she had won. The offensive pool was gone. The neighborhood looked exactly as she wanted. What she could not see was that beneath my house, workers were carefully shaping reinforced forms for something nearly 10 times more ambitious. Every evening after the crews left, I walked through the basement with a flashlight, reviewing progress and imagining the finished space. The concrete shell slowly took shape. Hidden plumbing lines were installed with military precision. Waterproof membranes covered every critical surface. Industrial filtration equipment waited in unopened crates along one wall. Standing in the center of the construction site, I realized Brenda had unknowingly given me an opportunity one never would have considered on my own. She thought she had ended my project forever. In reality, she had only convinced me to build something far more extraordinary than either of us had imagined. By the beginning of the second week, my house had become the most discussed property in Brookstone Ridge, even though almost nobody actually knew what was happening inside it. From the street, the only visible signs of activity were delivery trucks arriving every morning, contractors carrying equipment through the garage, and the occasional sound of concrete saws echoing for a few minutes before everything became quiet again. The garage door remained closed most of the time, and every delivery was scheduled carefully so nothing sensitive sat outside longer than necessary. Daniel insisted on that level of organization, not because we had anything to hide, but because unfinished engineering projects often looked confusing to people who only saw a few scattered pieces of the process. Inside, however, progress was impossible to ignore. The reinforced containment shell had been poured successfully, and after several days of curing, it looked less like a basement and more like the beginning of an indoor waterfront. Multiple inspection points had been built into the walls so future maintenance could be performed without damaging the structure. A sophisticated drainage collection system surrounded the outer shell, designed to detect even the smallest amount of unexpected moisture long before it could become a problem. Every step exceeded county requirements because I wanted every inspection report to leave absolutely no room for criticism. Daniel visited almost every afternoon after finishing his regular projects. Instead of simply checking measurements, he challenged every assumption. He verified the concrete strength reports, reviewed waterproof membrane installation, measured reinforcement spacing, and insisted on documenting everything with photographs. At first, I teased him for treating my basement like a commercial infrastructure project, but he only smiled. "If someone eventually questions this," he said, "documentation will answer before you ever have to." I appreciated that advice more each day because Brenda's curiosity had clearly turned into obsession. She drove past my house so often that even my elderly neighbor, Mr. Hansen, noticed the pattern. One evening while I was collecting my trash cans, he walked across the street carrying a glass of iced tea. "You know," he said with a grin, "your construction project has become Brenda's full-time hobby." I laughed. "Has she been asking questions?" "Everyone," he replied. "She asked the landscaping crew next door if they knew what you were building. Yesterday, she stopped the mail carrier to see whether you were receiving permits in the mail." I shook my head. She could save herself the effort by simply reading county records. "Everything is public." Mr. Hansen chuckled. "That would require patience." The next morning proved his point. I was reviewing plumbing layouts with the contractor when the doorbell rang. Standing outside was Brenda, dressed in an expensive white blazer with oversized sunglasses resting on her head, despite the cloudy weather. She smiled politely, but I recognized the expression immediately. It was the smile she used whenever she believed she was about to uncover something important. "Good morning, Grant," she said. I noticed quite a few construction vehicles again. "Good morning, Brenda. Several neighbors are concerned about the amount of work taking place." I glanced toward the quiet street. "Nobody has mentioned that to me. They spoke with me instead," she replied confidently. "I see." She looked past me toward the closed garage door. "Would you mind showing me the project? It would probably put everyone's mind at ease." I smiled politely. "I appreciate the suggestion, but this is a private renovation. The county inspectors have full access whenever inspections are scheduled." Her expression tightened ever so slightly. "The board likes to remain informed. The board has access to the same public permit information as everyone else." There was a brief silence before she changed tactics. "You are not building another recreational structure, are you?" "I am improving my property in full compliance with applicable regulations." Every word was carefully chosen because it was completely true. Brenda waited for me to elaborate. I did not. Finally, she thanked me with noticeably less enthusiasm than when she had arrived and walked back toward her luxury sport utility vehicle. Before driving away, she glanced once more at the garage, clearly hoping someone would accidentally open the door. Nobody did. Later that afternoon, Daniel laughed after hearing about the conversation. "She is fishing." "I know. Good thing you are not biting." The inspections continued exactly as planned. The plumbing inspector complimented the redundancy built into the drainage system. The electrical inspector approved the dedicated circuits for filtration equipment and lighting. The structural inspector spent nearly 40 minutes examining reinforcement details before signing the approval paperwork. Each successful inspection produced another official document that went directly into a binder on my office desk. The stack was becoming surprisingly thick. As construction advanced, the shape of the finished project finally became visible. Wide concrete steps descended gradually into the future waterline. A cedar walkway extended along one side where I planned to place chairs and potted plants. Recessed lighting had been installed behind waterproof panels, designed to reflect softly across the water rather than shine directly into anyone's eyes. The space no longer felt like a basement. It felt like a private retreat hidden beneath an ordinary suburban home. One Friday evening, after the contractors had left, I turned on the temporary work lights and stood alone in the center of the nearly completed structure. It was still empty, silent, and surrounded by construction materials. Yet I could already imagine calm water stretching from one end to the other. I pictured my nieces paddling a small kayak, friends gathering for quiet weekends, and the satisfaction of knowing every inch had been designed legally, professionally, and safely. Upstairs, another notification appeared on my phone from the neighborhood social media group. Someone had posted another rumor claiming I was secretly building an illegal apartment beneath my house. Another person guessed I was installing a commercial workshop. A third insisted I was preparing an underground storm shelter. I read every theory with amusement before setting the phone aside. None of them came close to the truth, and Brenda seemed determined to discover it before anyone else. The irony was almost perfect. She believed she had successfully eliminated one perfectly ordinary swimming pool, never realizing that every question she asked and every rule she rushed to create had quietly guided me towards something far beyond anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Construction entered its final phase during the third week, and for the first time I could see the finish line instead of just another list of engineering tasks. The waterproof membranes had passed every pressure test. The filtration equipment had been installed exactly according to the manufacturer's specifications, and the final cedar decking inside the basement was beginning to transform the space from a construction site into something that actually felt inviting. Every permit remained active, every inspection had been approved, and every contractor left signed documentation before leaving the property. Daniel joked that I probably had enough paperwork to build a courthouse instead of a private indoor lake. I told him that was exactly the point. If anyone ever questioned the project, the answer would already exist inside a binder instead of an argument. Outside the house, however, the atmosphere around the neighborhood had changed. Curiosity had slowly turned into speculation, and speculation was quickly becoming gossip. I learned this not because I spent time reading neighborhood discussions, but because several neighbors began asking unusually careful questions whenever we crossed paths. One afternoon, while checking my mailbox, a retired schoolteacher named Linda smiled and asked, "Grant, I keep hearing you are building something incredible. Should we believe the rumors?" I laughed. "That depends on which rumor you heard. Someone said you are building an underground theater. Afraid not. Someone else thinks it is a wine cellar. Also incorrect." She smiled. "Well, whatever it is, I hope you invite us someday." "If everything goes according to plan," I replied, "you will understand why I kept it quiet." Linda appreciated the answer without pushing further. Brenda did not share Linda's patience. 2 days later, I received an electronic notice from the HOA requesting what they described as a voluntary compliance visit to ensure no exterior violations were connected to the ongoing renovation. The wording sounded polite, but the intention was obvious. They wanted a reason to get inside my property. I read the request twice before drafting a brief response. I thanked the board for their concern, explained that all work was fully permitted through the county, and respectfully declined the inspection because the project involved only private interior improvements that did not require HOA access. I attached copies of the active permit numbers and the most recent inspection approvals simply to eliminate any claim that I was hiding something. Less than an hour later, Brenda replied personally instead of through the association. She wrote that transparency benefited the community and suggested that refusing access might create unnecessary concern among residents. I smiled while reading it because the message accidentally confirmed exactly what I had suspected. She had no evidence of any violation. She only had curiosity. Daniel stopped by that evening and read the email over my shoulder. "She is trying to pressure you into volunteering information." "I know. Do not take the bait." I was not planning to. The following morning, another county inspection took place, this time for the completed mechanical systems. The inspector spent nearly an hour testing circulation equipment, emergency shutoff controls, drainage redundancy, and electrical protection devices. Before leaving, he signed the final approval form and shook my hand. "I have inspected a lot of unusual residential projects," he said, "but I will admit this is one of the most thoroughly documented jobs I have seen." After he drove away, I placed the signed approval into the growing binder and realized that every major inspection was now complete. Only one step remained: filling the structure. Even that required careful planning. Daniel calculated the filling schedule so the water load would increase gradually while we monitored structural movement with precision measuring equipment installed around the foundation. Nothing would be rushed. Safety had always been the first priority. That afternoon, while contractors prepared the final valves and monitoring equipment, I noticed Brenda's vehicle parked across the street again. She remained inside for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally looking toward my garage before writing something in a notebook. She never crossed onto my property, and I never acknowledged her presence. Instead, I focused on reviewing the final checklist with Daniel. Every valve had been tested twice. Every sensor had been calibrated. Every measurement matched the engineering model within an exceptionally small margin. As the sun began to set, the contractors packed away their remaining tools, leaving the basement remarkably clean for the first time since construction had begun. Standing beside the empty concrete basin, I realized that months from now people would probably remember the finished result. Very few would appreciate how much planning, engineering, patience, and careful documentation had made it possible. Brenda still believed she was waiting to discover my secret. She had no idea that by the following week there would be nothing left to discover because the project would no longer be hidden. It would simply exist, completely legal, fully inspected, and impossible to ignore. The morning we began filling the basin felt strangely quiet. After weeks of construction noise, inspections, measurements, and paperwork, the most important stage required patience instead of heavy equipment. Daniel arrived before sunrise carrying a clipboard filled with monitoring charts, while the plumbing contractor performed one final inspection of every valve and connection. We agreed that nothing would happen until every gauge, sensor, and emergency shutoff had been tested one last time. Safety had guided every decision from the beginning, and there was no reason to abandon that principle now. The first stream of water entered the basin just after 7 o'clock. It looked almost insignificant as it flowed across the smooth concrete floor, but every minute the water line climbed a little higher. Daniel recorded measurements from reference points installed throughout the foundation while I monitored the structural sensors from a laptop connected to the monitoring system. Every reading remained exactly where it should be. Hour after hour, the project slowly transformed. The empty shell that had occupied my basement for weeks gradually reflected the ceiling lights like polished glass. By midday, the water had reached the first landing of the cedar walkway. By evening, it stretched across nearly the entire room. The following day, we continued the process until the system reached its planned operating level of approximately 50,000 gallons. Even after all the engineering calculations, seeing that much crystal-clear water beneath my home felt almost surreal. The filtration equipment started smoothly, producing nothing more than a soft, steady hum. Gentle circulation created faint ripples across the surface, while the recessed lighting reflected warm patterns against the walls. The cedar walkway framed one side of the indoor lake, and a small floating dock rested securely near the shallow entry steps. Two lightweight kayaks, which had been delivered the previous afternoon, now floated quietly beside the dock waiting for their first trip. Standing there, I realized the space no longer resembled a basement in any meaningful way. It felt peaceful, open, and remarkably calm. Daniel slowly looked around before smiling. I have designed municipal infrastructure that received less planning than this. I laughed. Then I suppose we did something right. He nodded toward the water. Everything performed exactly as the calculations predicted. We spent another full day observing the system. Water quality remained excellent. Structural measurements showed no unexpected movement. The ventilation system maintained comfortable humidity levels throughout the house, and every backup pump functioned perfectly during testing. Only after every checklist had been completed did I finally allow myself to believe the project was truly finished. Rather than keeping it a secret any longer, I decided the best approach was complete openness. I invited several neighbors who had always treated me kindly, including Linda, Mr. Hansen, and two families whose children often visited during summer weekends. When they arrived, I welcomed them inside without saying much about what they were about to see. As we walked downstairs, their conversations gradually faded. Linda stopped halfway down the staircase and quietly said, "I was expecting almost anything except this." Mr. Hansen removed his baseball cap and laughed. "Grant, you actually built a lake under your house." The children stared across the water with wide eyes before asking whether the kayaks were real. I handed them life jackets that had already been purchased for future family visits and explained that everyone would have an opportunity to enjoy the space another day after I finished a few remaining details. Nobody seemed interested in gossip anymore. They were simply impressed by the craftsmanship and surprised that such a project could exist inside an ordinary suburban home. Before leaving, Linda looked around one more time and smiled. "Now I understand why you never answered the rumors." I smiled back. It was easier to let people imagine something ordinary. Word traveled through Brookstone Ridge faster than I expected. By that evening, several neighbors had already heard that the mysterious renovation was not an apartment, a theater, or a workshop. It was a fully permitted indoor lake. I never posted photographs online, and I never made dramatic announcements. The people who visited simply shared what they had seen. Less than 24 hours later, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed Brenda Holloway's name. I answered politely. Her voice sounded unusually controlled. "Grant, I have heard several interesting stories today. Neighborhoods tend to produce those." She paused before continuing. "Would you mind explaining exactly what you built?" I looked across the perfectly still water reflecting the cedar ceiling lights and smiled to myself. "I would be happy to explain," I replied. "As soon as you read the same permits and inspection reports that approved every single part of it." The following Monday confirmed exactly what Daniel and I had expected from the beginning. Brenda was not interested in whether my project was safe, professionally built, or fully compliant with every applicable regulation. She was interested in finding some way, any way, to undo it. At 9 o'clock that morning, a county building inspector arrived at my front door after receiving what he politely described as a citizen complaint requesting an additional review. He introduced himself, explained why he was there, and immediately clarified that the visit did not mean any violation had occurred. I welcomed him inside without hesitation. We walked through the basement together while I handed him the complete project binder containing permits, engineering calculations, inspection reports, material certifications, and photographs documenting every stage of construction. He spent nearly an hour reviewing the paperwork before examining the indoor lake itself. He tested emergency shutoff controls, inspected the mechanical room, confirmed ventilation performance, verified drainage capacity, and compared the completed structure with the approved engineering drawings. When he finished, he closed the binder with a small smile. "I honestly wish every homeowner kept records like this," he said. "Everything matches the approved plans." Before leaving, he thanked me for making the inspection straightforward. Less than 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. He had heard from someone at the engineering office that another complaint had already been submitted before the first inspection had even finished. We both laughed because the pattern had become obvious. Brenda was hoping that repeated reviews would eventually uncover something someone had missed. 2 days later, a representative from the county environmental office arrived after receiving a question about water management. Once again, I welcomed the official inside. We reviewed the closed-loop filtration system, water conservation measures, overflow protections, and drainage safeguards. The representative complimented the design and confirmed that the system met local requirements because it was a contained private installation with appropriate safeguards. Another report was completed. Another complaint quietly disappeared. By the end of the week, a fire safety inspector visited after concerns had allegedly been raised about emergency access. He carefully evaluated exits, electrical protection systems, ventilation equipment, and smoke detection. His inspection concluded exactly like the others. There were no deficiencies. Every recommendation already appeared in my construction documents because Daniel and I had voluntarily exceeded several minimum standards during the design phase. I began to notice an unexpected change throughout the neighborhood. Instead of asking suspicious questions, neighbors started asking practical ones. Linda wanted to know how the humidity stayed under control. Mr. Hansen was curious about the filtration equipment. Another neighbor asked whether the structure affected the home's insurance policy. I answered every question honestly because there was nothing mysterious left to hide. The more transparent I became, the less believable the rumors sounded. Meanwhile, Brenda appeared increasingly frustrated. One afternoon, I saw her speaking with 2 members of the HOA board outside the clubhouse. Their conversation looked animated, and several times she pointed toward my house while holding a folder in her hands. A few days later, I received another certified letter from the association. This time the board claimed my indoor lake represented an amenity that allegedly altered the character of the community and requested that I voluntarily discontinue its use while they reviewed possible rule changes. I read the letter twice before placing it beside the growing collection of HOA correspondence. Then I opened the governing documents once again. There was still no language regulating interior recreational features located entirely within a private residence. More importantly, the board had no authority to suspend the lawful use of private property simply because it disliked the result. Rather than responding emotionally, I asked an attorney who specialized in property association law to review the situation. After reading every document, including Brenda's newest letter, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Your engineering work is impressive," he said, "but your paperwork may be even stronger." He explained that the association could certainly propose future amendments through the proper process, but applying new restrictions retroactively against an already completed and lawfully approved project would face significant legal obstacles. "Keep every letter," he advised. "Document every interaction. Stay professional. Let them make the mistakes." That advice fit perfectly with everything Daniel had been telling me since the first day. I never argued with Brenda. I never insulted the board. I simply answered every complaint with facts, every accusation with documentation, and every inspection with complete cooperation. As the weeks passed, something interesting happened. County officials stopped appearing because there was nothing left to inspect. Contractors stopped visiting because the work had been completed successfully. The only people still trying to turn the project into a problem were the very individuals who had inspired it in the first place. Standing beside the calm water one quiet evening, I realized the balance of the entire situation had quietly shifted. Brenda believed she was forcing me to defend my decisions. In reality, every unsuccessful complaint, every unnecessary letter, and every failed attempt to challenge a fully legal project was creating a detailed record of the association's own behavior. and that record was becoming more valuable with every passing day. About a month after the indoor lake became fully operational, the atmosphere inside Brookstone Ridge had changed in a way I never expected. People had stopped talking about my project as though it were a scandal and had started treating it like an interesting engineering accomplishment. Neighbors who had barely spoken to me before now asked thoughtful questions about structural design, water filtration, and energy efficiency instead of repeating rumors. Even the county officials who had visited during the various inspections occasionally emailed Daniel to compliment the level of documentation we had prepared. The only person who seemed unwilling to let the situation settle was Brenda Holloway. She could not accept that every attempt to challenge the project had ended with another official confirming that everything complied with applicable regulations. One Tuesday afternoon, I received a notice announcing a special HOA board meeting. The stated purpose was to discuss proposed amendments involving indoor recreational water features and other privately owned residential improvements. The wording alone made me smile because everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly what the proposal was really about. Although attendance was optional, I decided to go, not because I intended to argue, but because I wanted to hear every discussion firsthand. The clubhouse was unusually crowded when I arrived. Residents filled nearly every chair, and several people stood along the walls. Brenda sat confidently at the front wearing another expensive designer outfit decorated with oversized jewelry that reflected the ceiling lights whenever she moved. She opened the meeting by speaking about preserving neighborhood standards and protecting property values. For several minutes, she never mentioned my name, but everyone understood who inspired the proposed amendment. Eventually, she displayed a draft rule that would prohibit large indoor water features exceeding a specified capacity inside private residences. She spoke as though the proposal were simply a routine housekeeping update. Then one of the homeowners raised a hand. It was Linda. Would this apply to existing projects that were already legally permitted and completed? Brenda hesitated before answering. That is certainly the board's intention. Another resident immediately spoke up. Can the board legally do that? Brenda answered with noticeably less confidence. We believe we have broad authority. Before she could continue, another board member quietly leaned toward her and whispered something. Although I could not hear the words, I saw Brenda's expression change. The association's attorney, who had been sitting near the front, requested permission to clarify the legal issue. He explained calmly that while associations could generally adopt new rules through the proper procedures, applying those rules retroactively against completed projects presented significant legal risks and would likely invite expensive litigation. The room became noticeably quieter. Several homeowners exchanged surprised looks. One gentleman near the back asked the obvious question. Then why are we discussing this if it cannot solve the situation that started it? Nobody answered immediately. Instead, another resident stood and explained that he had recently reviewed the governing documents himself after hearing about my project. He pointed out that many homeowners had never been informed about the emergency amendment banning above-ground pools until after it had already been approved. That comment opened an entirely different discussion. People began asking when the meeting had been announced, how notice had been distributed, and whether proper procedures had actually been followed. Brenda attempted to regain control of the conversation, but the questions kept coming. Several homeowners admitted they had never received advance notice of the vote. Others questioned why such an important change had been rushed through without broader community input. I remained completely silent. There was no reason for me to participate because the discussion was no longer about my basement. It had become a conversation about transparency, governance, and trust. The attorney recommended postponing the proposed amendment until the board could review both the governing documents and the applicable state laws more carefully. The motion passed without much resistance. As people gathered their belongings, several neighbors approached me instead of Brenda. Mr. Hansen laughed quietly. Looks like your engineering project accidentally became a civics lesson. Linda smiled and added, sometimes people only start reading the rules after something unexpected happens. I agreed with both of them. While leaving the clubhouse, I noticed Brenda standing near the entrance speaking quietly with two remaining board members. Her confident smile had disappeared. For the first time since our disagreement began, she looked less certain that simply creating another rule would produce the outcome she wanted. Over the next several days, I continued living exactly as I had before. I paddled one of the small kayaks across the calm indoor water during quiet evenings, maintained the filtration system according to schedule, and kept every inspection report, every letter, every email, and every meeting notice carefully organized inside my office. Daniel stopped by one evening and looked at the growing stack of documents before shaking his head with a grin. "You know," he said, "this binder is becoming almost as impressive as the lake itself." I smiled. Something tells me it may become even more important before this is over. Neither of us realized just how soon those records would become the foundation for everything that happened next. The turning point arrived far more quietly than I had imagined. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, and no sudden announcement. Instead, it began with a certified envelope delivered to my mailbox on a cool Thursday morning. Inside was yet another formal notice from the HOA claiming that my indoor lake created an unreasonable burden on the community because it allegedly encouraged future projects that could alter neighborhood character. This time, however, the letter included something different. It threatened legal action if I refused to remove or permanently deactivate the installation within 30 days. I read the notice carefully from beginning to end before placing it beside the thick binder that now contained months of correspondence. Then I called my attorney. When I arrived at his office that afternoon, I placed every document on the conference table in chronological order. The permits, engineering reports, inspection approvals, certified letters, electronic messages, meeting notices, and written responses formed a timeline that stretched across the entire table. He spent nearly an hour reviewing everything without interruption. Finally, he leaned back and folded his hands. "Grant," he said, "they have unintentionally documented a pattern that works in your favor." He explained that disagreements between homeowners and associations were not unusual, but repeated efforts to challenge a fully permitted project after every government inspection had confirmed compliance created a very different picture. Every unsuccessful complaint, every unsupported allegation, and every demand that ignored the governing documents demonstrated that the board had continued escalating the dispute even after receiving clear answers. "What do you recommend?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "I recommend that we stop playing defense." Within the next week, my attorney filed a formal legal action requesting declaratory relief confirming my lawful use of the property while also seeking appropriate remedies related to the association's repeated attempts to interfere with that lawful use. The filing relied almost entirely on documents the HOA had generated themselves. Ironically, the strongest evidence came from Brenda's own letters, meeting notices, and repeated requests that contradicted both the governing documents and the inspection results. Daniel laughed when he heard about it. "They spent months building your case for you." "Without realizing it," I replied. The legal process moved more efficiently than I expected because there were remarkably few disputed facts. Nobody questioned that the indoor lake existed. Nobody questioned that permits had been issued. Nobody questioned that county inspectors had repeatedly approved every stage of the project. The discussion centered almost entirely on whether the HOA possessed authority to override those lawful approvals after the project had already been completed. During one hearing, the judge asked a straightforward question that seemed to change the tone of the entire proceeding. "Can the association identify any specific provision that prohibited this interior project before construction began?" Brenda's attorney reviewed several documents before admitting that no such provision existed at the time. The judge then asked another question. Did government inspectors approve the completed work? The answer was yes. Were subsequent inspections unable to identify any code violations? Again, the answer was yes. Those simple exchanges summarized months of conflict more effectively than any lengthy argument could have. Outside the courtroom, I remained polite whenever I encountered Brenda. We nodded briefly to each other, but exchanged very few words. I noticed that her confidence seemed noticeably different from our first meeting beside my mailbox. She no longer spoke as though every disagreement had an obvious outcome. Back in the neighborhood, residents followed the situation with growing interest, yet the conversations sounded very different from those during the early weeks of construction. Instead of repeating rumors, people discussed meeting procedures, homeowner rights, and the importance of reading association documents before approving major changes. Several neighbors admitted they had begun attending board meetings for the first time because they realized how much influence those decisions could have on everyday life. One evening, Linda stopped by while I was performing routine maintenance on the filtration system. She looked across the calm water and smiled. "You know, this stopped being about a lake a long time ago." I nodded. "I think it became about accountability." She agreed. "People are paying attention now." She was right. Attendance at board meetings increased noticeably, and homeowners who had rarely spoken during previous gatherings started asking thoughtful questions about voting procedures, financial decisions, and rule changes. Transparency had become the topic instead of my basement. Several weeks later, the court issued a written decision confirming that my project had been lawfully permitted and completed under the applicable regulations in effect at the time of construction. The ruling also recognized that later rule changes could not simply erase rights that had already been established through the proper legal process. Reading those pages felt surprisingly calm rather than triumphant. I had never wanted a fight. I had simply wanted to enjoy my property while following every applicable rule. As I closed the decision and placed it inside the now overstuffed binder, I realized that every permit I had obtained, every inspection I had welcomed, every conversation I had documented, and every patient decision to answer conflict with facts instead of emotion had led to this moment. The indoor lake had never been the most important thing I built. The strongest foundation turned out to be the careful record proving that doing everything the right way still mattered. Life inside Brookstone Ridge gradually settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly ordinary again, except for one detail that no visitor ever expected. Beneath my home, 50,000 gallons of crystal-clear water reflected warm cedar walls, quiet lighting, and the countless hours of planning that had transformed one frustrating situation into something I genuinely enjoyed. The indoor lake quickly became part of my daily routine rather than a symbol of conflict. Some evenings I quietly paddled one of the kayaks across the calm surface after work. Other weekends my nieces visited, laughing as they explored the small dock and admired the fish-shaped decorations we added around the seating area. What had started as a reaction to an unfair decision eventually became my favorite place in the entire house. The neighborhood changed as well. Attendance at HOA meetings remained noticeably higher than it had been before everything happened. Homeowners who once ignored association business now read meeting agendas, reviewed proposed amendments, and asked thoughtful questions before votes took place. Discussions became calmer, more transparent, and far more respectful than they had been months earlier. It turned out that people were not opposed to reasonable rules. They simply wanted those rules to be created fairly and applied consistently. Brenda Holloway remained in the neighborhood for several more months, but her influence slowly faded. Following the growing concerns raised by homeowners about communication, meeting procedures, and transparency, a regular board election brought new leadership into the association. The transition happened peacefully, and the incoming board immediately focused on rebuilding trust with residents instead of searching for unnecessary conflicts. One of their first actions was reviewing several recent policy changes to ensure every future amendment followed the governing documents exactly as written. A few weeks after the election, I received a handwritten note from the new board president thanking me for always remaining professional throughout the dispute and for cooperating with every legitimate inspection request. I appreciated the gesture because, despite everything that had happened, I had never wanted to create divisions within the community. I simply believed that homeowners deserve the same fairness from their association that the association expected from homeowners. Daniel visited one Saturday afternoon carrying a fishing hat and a grin that immediately made me laugh. He looked across the water, shook his head, and said, "Do you realize this entire project started because someone wanted to remove one perfectly ordinary swimming pool?" I smiled as we launched the kayaks onto the calm water. Sometimes the smallest decisions create the biggest consequences. We spent the next hour quietly paddling beneath the house, while sunlight filtered through the small basement windows. The filtration system hummed softly in the background, almost unnoticed after months of hearing it every day. It was difficult to believe that this peaceful place had once existed only as a sketch on my dining room table, surrounded by legal documents and engineering calculations. Looking back, I realized I had learned lessons that reached far beyond construction or homeowners associations. Patience had accomplished more than anger ever could. Careful preparation had proven stronger than emotional arguments. Documentation had defeated assumptions. Most importantly, treating every person with respect, even during disagreement, had allowed the facts to speak louder than frustration. If I had reacted impulsively when Brenda first delivered that violation notice, I probably would have spent months trapped in endless arguments that solved nothing. Instead, I focused on understanding the rules, following every requirement, respecting the legal process, and building something that could withstand not only engineering inspections, but also every challenge that followed. That approach changed the outcome completely. Every permit, every inspection, every photograph, every receipt, and every written response became another piece of a foundation that extended far beyond concrete and steel. Even today, neighbors occasionally ask whether I would do it all again if I knew how much work it would require. My answer never changes. I would not choose the conflict, but I would absolutely choose the preparation, the patience, and the commitment to doing everything the right way. Those choices gave me far more than an indoor lake. They reminded me that standing your ground does not require raising your voice when you have facts, professionalism, and persistence on your side. And every time I look across the calm water beneath my home, I remember that the strongest victories are often the quiet ones that are built carefully, one thoughtful decision at a time. Now I would genuinely like to hear your opinion. What would you have done if an association suddenly changed the rules after your project had already been completed? And do you think Grant handled the situation the right way? Share your thoughts in the comments because I always enjoy reading different perspectives. If you enjoy stories about property rights, clever solutions, and real-world neighborhood conflicts, subscribing to the channel is a wonderful way to make sure you do not miss the next story. Thank you for spending your time with me, and I will see you in the next one.